Welcome to this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. My name is Daniel Murphy and I am assistant editor of the journal. If you are new to these podcasts, please visit the Florida Historical Quarterly on Facebook, where you can now access abstracts of each article in the current issue of the journal. In 2015, the FHQ will continue publishing a series of 6 special issues in recognition of the quincentennial of Ponce de Leon's first visit to Florida in 1513. Next year's special issue is dedicated to Florida history during the 18th century and will be guest edited by Professor Sherry Johnson. Please look forward to publication of the issue in early 2015. Today's podcast features an interview with Dr. Matt Clavin, Associate Professor of History at the University of Houston. He is the author, editor, or co-editor of several works, including Toussaint Louverture and the Civil War, The Promise and Peril of the Second Haitian Revolution. In today's interview, Dr. Clavin and I discuss the content of his article titled An Underground Railway to Pensacola and the Impending Crisis Over Slavery that was recently published in the spring 2014 issue of the FHQ.
Okay, we'll get right to it. Please introduce yourself to our audience and tell us a little bit about your academic background.
Hi, I'm Professor Matt Clavin. I'm an Associate Professor of History at the University of Houston in Houston, Texas. In graduate school, I wanted to study, I wanted to write about, racism. And to understand racism, everyone knows you have to start at the beginning. And for many people, the beginning is the rise of slavery in the Americas. And increasingly, the more I studied slavery, and oftentimes slave resistance, I was so impressed with the way people resisted enslavement. I was also increasingly enthralled with free people who were crazy enough or, committed enough that they would actually try to help slaves to escape. So in general, I just have a great fascination with slavery and slaves' allies, in many cases abolitionist, in some cases not organized abolitionist. And then after graduate school in 2005, I got a position at the University of West Florida in Pensacola, fascinated with the idea of slavery in Pensacola, and I was shocked to find the persistence of fugitive slaves in Pensacola. In the colonial era, in the antebellum era, escaping from slavery was almost impossible, in particular if you lived in the Deep South, in a place like Pensacola. Nevertheless, from the colonial era through the Civil War, I have since documented hundreds upon hundreds of cases of fugitive slaves running to and from Pensacola, oftentimes unaided and unassisted by anyone, but oftentimes they are in fact aided and assisted by other people. So living in Pensacola for 6 years, doing that research, it has all just sort of stirred this new project I'm working on, which is the idea of runaway slaves and their allies in Pensacola in the century before the Civil War.
Yeah, really interesting how you got to this place, and you mentioned Pensacola a couple of times, and in your article you addressed Pensacola. Can you describe slavery or briefly describe slavery in Pensacola during the antebellum era, and was it unique in Pensacola as opposed to other areas?
It is such a complex question, so I guess there's 2 answers. Number one, it was very much like other small southern towns and cities. Slave owners had hegemony. They were in charge, and they had powerful friends at their disposal. The courts, for example, lawmakers, the state government, the U.S. military if they needed it. I mean, bottom line is, Pensacola was a part of the South after 1821. And so in Pensacola, for slaves, it could just be an awful situation. Slave owners were violent. They used corporal punishment. They could be sadistic. There was the internal slave trade. So on one hand, the situation is as bleak for slaves in Pensacola as it is elsewhere. But on the other, there's a whole other side to this story, where although Pensacola does become a part of the South officially, it is always on the margins of the South. It is a frontier town. I mean, people in Pensacola today would still argue that it's frontier-like, certainly on the outskirts of the city. So in the antebellum era in particular, slavery was unique slavery had a frontier character. And what I mean by that was there was less oversight of slaves. There were less powerful slave owners. Slaves didn't work on plantations. You couldn't grow cotton in Pensacola or the vicinity. What you had was sand, and you can't grow cotton in sand. And so most of the slave labor in Pensacola was in trade. It was in domestic service. And increasingly, beginning in the 1820s and 30s, it was public slavery. Slaves, hundreds, thousands over the course of several decades. They worked for the U.S. military. They worked at the Pensacola Navy Yard. They built Fort Pickens and Fort Barrancas and Fort McRae. And so bottom line is, for slaves in Pensacola, many of their experiences were very different from the typical antebellum slave. So, Pensacola slavery was very similar in some cases to the rest of the South. In other cases, it was very different.
In your article, you focus on the stories of Jonathan Walker and Columbus Jones. Can you tell us a little bit about them and why their stories kind of captured the nation's attention?
Okay, Jonathan Walker is easy. I mean, he's a white abolitionist, and just as everyone today knows John Brown, radical white abolitionist who was willing to die for black people. Jonathan Walker was very similar. He's just much less well known today. He ends up on the Gulf Coast. He's a very impoverished man. He has several children, a wife and kids he can't feed, and so he goes where the jobs are. He ends up in Mexico, he's in Mobile, and then he's back in Pensacola several times. And ultimately, he makes a living there. His family is with him on occasion, but at one point he sends his family back home because he's very distraught and disturbed by the racial climate. But make no mistake about it, when he's in Pensacola, he lives among African Americans as equals. He works beside them. He employs some while he works at a railroad depot. And he's just an open-minded Northerner. He happens to be an abolitionist who happens to live in Pensacola for several years in the 1830s and 40s. And at one point in the 1840s, several slaves who he was well acquainted with, went to church with several of them, worked with several of them. They asked him to take them away from Pensacola. I don't know enough about these men. We do know that they're probably from Virginia. I suspect they were trying to get back to Virginia, but what Walker tells them, that he may take them to Virginia, but they need to go to the Bahamas first. Bahamas was a British colony at the time. Slavery was abolished in the 1830s. And so Walker is being pragmatic here, and he thinks, let's first get from Florida to the Bahamas, and then I imagine, weeks, months later, we'll get all the way to Virginia or wherever I need to take you to reunite with family or anywhere else where you need to be free. So Jonathan Walker, he tries to help these slaves escape. They are captured in South Florida, not far from the Bahamas. They're all taken back to Pensacola. The slaves are beaten and returned to their owners. Jonathan Walker is incarcerated for a little more than a year, and very memorably, he is part of his punishment. He is branded on his hand with the letters SS for slave stealer. But when he returns to the North after this very trying time, obviously, he's a little shocked to find out that he has become this cause célèbre of the abolition movement. It's not just in the North in the United States. It's in England. It's in Europe. People have learned about this martyr for slavery. So for many, Northerners, many people in Europe, to learn how a white man could be, corporally punished in the South for trying to help slaves, really touched a chord. Slaves were brutalized for generations, but now that it was happening to, white abolitionists, it really awoken a lot of people to the plight of slaves. And, as far as Columbus Jones is concerned, I think by the 1850s and 60s, when his case becomes famous, abolition is really taking off in the United States and elsewhere. And increasingly, abolitionists are just absolutely amazed at the indomitability of African-American slaves. And for someone like Columbus Jones, who is a serial runaway, he tries to escape on numerous occasions, and eventually he makes it all the way to Massachusetts. And again, he's returned to slavery. He doesn't become free. But for abolitionist, this is the perfect role model for black slaves. It is he is a symbol of a great American freedom fighter. And so while Jonathan Walker, there's a lot of racial connotations about why he becomes so famous, for Columbus Jones, I think it's really just a case of an American, in this case an enslaved African American, who is absolutely unwilling to remain a slave. He is enamored with freedom. He will die for freedom. In fact, at one point, he tells his slave capturers that he will not go back to Pensacola alive if he is enslaved. So he's a very inspirational freedom fighter for a lot of abolitionists, undoubtedly.
Both the stories are fascinating. It's like I said, you can learn a lot from this article on those two guys, in addition to a lot of other things. But you keep talking about the Underground Railroad, and in your article you talk about how it's recently got a lot more attention from scholars. Could you talk a little bit about just the Underground Railroad in general, and also how Pensacola factored into it in terms of, in relation to the rest of the South or the nation as a whole? How did Pensacola function in terms of the Underground Railroad relative to other places?
Okay, for starters, it wasn't long ago that if you studied or talked about the Underground Railroad or tried to publish about the Underground Railroad, academics shunned you. The Underground Railroad was considered for a long time a legend, a myth. But really, leading scholars have made it crystal clear in the last generation or so that the Underground Railroad did in fact exist. And, it was not underground. It did not ordinarily involve a railroad. But there was this subversive network of anti-slavery radicals, black and white, a lot of Quakers, and they actually did incredible things. They took incredible steps to help enslaved people become free. And so now, as I said, there has been this explosion of scholarship, really reputable scholarship on the actual Underground Railroad. It was always my dream, if you will, to discover in Pensacola this long-standing organized network of anti-slavery radicals. I didn't find that. And so for anyone who wants to discuss Pensacola and its relationship with the Underground Railroad, you have to be flexible in your definition of the Underground Railroad. In fact, I would argue the Underground Railroad demands a much wider definition than we ordinarily afford it. Jonathan Walker is one of the few cases of an actual conductor of the Underground Railroad living in Pensacola. In the case of Columbus Jones, he is not aided and abetted by the Underground Railroad until he gets to New England. There's another famous case involving a slave named Adam, and he gets to the north from Pensacola after stowing away on a boat, and he also is helped by the Underground Railroad, but not until he gets to Massachusetts. So I think what is fascinating is over the years in Pensacola, there's this epidemic of runaway slaves. While most of these slaves, as mentioned before, they do this on their own, unassisted, unaided by anyone. However, what I have found is there's a large contingent of people in Pensacola along the Gulf Coast who almost by accident will help slaves escape. Ship captains are a great example, but also crew members on ships who hide slaves, underneath the deck until they reach free territory. There are Native Americans who will help slaves escape and help slaves hide out in their villages. There are, poor white mechanics, railroad operatives like Walker, all sorts of types who work alongside African Americans, pray alongside African Americans, spend evenings in taverns and other watering holes alongside African Americans, and when push comes to shove, oftentimes they will help slaves escape. And while I wouldn't consider these people abolitionists, they are absolutely doing the work of Underground Railroad agents. So I think if you expand and widen the definition of the Underground Railroad, you start to see that even in remote Pensacola, slaves had a small chance, but a chance to escape nonetheless.
Your research is really, it's going to make us change our understanding of freedom and slavery in Florida, I think, especially in Pensacola, but really other places as well. Is there anything else you'd like the listeners to know about your research or this article?
It's funny you bring it up. I forget. I'm so involved in the research of Pensacola, but I can think back to several years ago when this whole project first began, and maybe one of the first things I realized when I started the research was how little had been written about slavery in Pensacola. And like you said, there's a huge literature on slavery in Florida. But if you read that literature, it's almost all, East Florida, in particular around St. Augustine, but also increasingly Middle Florida. There's a huge literature that has emerged. And to be completely honest, I've never quite figured out why West Florida has been ignored to such an extent, why slavery in Pensacola has been ignored by historians, but it's a fact. So I do hope that my work will shed light on a topic that just hasn't gotten the attention it deserved. And I should also add that, this larger project I'm working on, this article comes from a book that I'm wrapping up now, but what I intend to do ultimately is show that this persistence of fugitive slaves in Pensacola, it was not just an antebellum phenomenon. I mean, this started in the colonial era when the Spanish ruled. It continued when the British ruled. It continued when the Spanish ruled again. It continues through the antebellum era. And during the Civil War, fugitive slaves are absolutely vital to the destruction of slavery along the Gulf Coast. So this, I think, the most extraordinary aspect of fugitive slaves in the Underground Railroad in Pensacola is not that it is isolated or limited to the 40 years before the Civil War. This is a trend that slave owners and other white elites seem utterly unable to stop in the century before the Civil War.
Well, much to think about regarding this research. Professor Clavin, thank you very much for speaking with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, and these podcasts are a great resource for readers and listeners, so hopefully this will draw more attention to what I think is a really fascinating historical topic.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you for joining our international audience for this podcast of the Florida Historical Quarterly. The Florida Historical Quarterly is the peer-reviewed scholarly journal of the Florida Historical Society. The Society was founded in 1856 and is the only statewide historical organization in the state of Florida. The Society is headquartered in Cocoa, Florida, and the editorial offices of the journal are in the Department of History at the University of Central Florida. I hope you have enjoyed the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast and that you will consider supporting future scholarship on Florida history by becoming a member of the Florida Historical Society. In recognition of the quincentennial of Ponce de Leon's first visit to Florida in 1513, the FHQ is publishing a series of 6 special issues, each devoted to examining Florida over the previous 5 centuries. We look forward to receiving your feedback on these special issues and other future volumes as well. We also invite researchers to access back issues of the Florida Historical Quarterly on JSTOR. Thank you again for listening to the Florida Historical Quarterly podcast. If you enjoy listening to this interview and know of others who enjoy history, please tell them about the podcast and have them find us on Facebook.